Okay. So now we're on Facebook Live. We're also recording this. If you know people who would find this topic interesting with the wonderful teacher, they'll be able to certainly be part of our next, but couldn't be here today. They'll join us for our next two classes, which will be basically every 2 weeks. And they'll be able to access the recording of our first class today. So I'll just give a brief introduction. First of all, welcome everybody, and some new faces are here who normally don't join us for the Advanced Learning Institute. I will just say that if you'd like to be on our Advanced Learning Institute email list so that you get notices about all the interesting scholars that we have coming, on a variety of topics, you can sign up, and I'll put the link to be on that list in the chat. Everybody is welcome. And it's so good to see you, Esther and Susan, Eleanor, Barbara. What a great group, and I'm looking forward to meeting some new faces. Jackie, welcome. Okay, K'vod Weeder, who is he? First of all, one of my best friends in the whole world, and a wonderful rabbi who has not only mixes the gift of great scholarship and deep heart with his scholarship, and most of all, the nicest thing you can say about anybody is that he is one of the kindest people I know, which is really, I think, the only way to kind of do this work, to bring people to their most meaningful spiritual selves. So it's been my privilege to be his student for the last many years, and it's a joy to share him with you today. He'll be back again later in the year, but I'm going to turn this over to you, K'vod.
So appreciate that, Rabbi Marcia, and it's great to be with everybody this morning. I just have to also say, over the last year or two, in addition to Rabbi Marcia and my friendship, it's been such a pleasure to continue to support and be a part of the work of the collaborative in all the different ways. And so great to be here this morning. What our topic for these 3 sessions, today, in 2 weeks, January 29th, and 2 more weeks, February 11th, is Neo-Hasidism. And this class today is going to be really about opening up exactly what that is. But the subtitle is A Creative Approach to Making Jewish Meditation and Spirituality Accessible. So the main, in our Jewish tradition, there have always been, and we have records of this specifically up until, pretty much into rabbinic and Talmudic times, but of course, there's no doubt that it was earlier as well. But there has always been people that have been interested in a direct experience and relationship with God. And in a sense, when we talk about Jewish mysticism or spirituality, those are very open words, very expansive words. But in a sense, what I want to use those to refer to is not just thinking about or talking about ideas of the universe, of our place in it, of God, but instead to begin to taste for ourselves and have a direct experience. And really, just where we first see this coming out is in early Talmudic literature, which is there were 2 kinds of literature and experience. One was called Hechalot literature, which Hechalot means palaces. And it was really about people that were involved in doing spiritual meditation, prayer practices to transcend worlds into deeper dimensions of consciousness, what the rabbis at that time called palaces. The other main body of mystical literature in Judaism was Merkava literature, and Merkava means chariot. And this was really based on the vision of Ezekiel. Ezekiel has this wild, amazing, psychedelic vision of angels. We read that on the first day of Shavuot with the reading of the Torah. And what the rabbis, many of the rabbis got very immersed in looking at Ezekiel's vision, which had happened 500-600 years before, as a as like a blueprint, almost like a metaphorical blueprint of meditative consciousness, of deepening that kind of direct experience. And so they taught how that could be. Then and I would say that this kind of literature and mysticism was probably from Talmudic times to early Middle Ages. And then around the 10th through 13th century, there's another kind of big flowering of Jewish mystical work and thought, which was really due to a Jewish Sufi dialogue and relationships that were happening in Egypt at that time and in Spain. And here we have the work of Bachya ibn Pekuda, wrote a book called Chovot Levavot, Duties of the Heart. And that kind of Jewish Sufi connection that was very much about devotional meditation and prayer continues through the Rambam, through Maimonides, and Maimonides' son and grandson, Abraham and Ovadia Maimonides, that talk even more explicitly than their father and grandfather about this kind of deeper, more direct experience of God. Many people think about Maimonides as just a rational philosopher, very heady guy, which he is. But there's also a lot of scholarship that shows the ways in which his thinking, and especially his third chapter of the Guide of Perplexed, or third section of the Guide for the Perplexed, is really a little bit of a meditative mystical manual. So that was 10th through 13th century. And then, of course, many of us are familiar with what we call Kabbalah, which was really flowered around 13th century, 14th century, with the Zohar and other holy books at that time, which were very much, the rabbis there were very driven with creating these mystical maps for consciousness, maps of the Sphirot, of the Tree of Life, that talked about the various divine emanations, and really tried to map in a metaphysical way kind of the deeper and deeper layers of consciousness and experience. And that was practiced, all the way through. There was another big flowering of Kabbalah, 16th century, in northern Israel in Sfat, with Rabbi Isaac Luria, or the Ari, and all of his disciples, Moshe Cordovero, Shlomo Alkabetz, who wrote Lecha Dodi. Our Kabbalat Shabbat service came from that kind of new take on creative flowering of that earlier Kabbalah Zohar experience. So that's kind of where we're kind of moving up and putting into context before we get to Hasidut, or Hasidism, which then will move into what we now know as Neo-Hasidism. So, but before I continue, I believe that Rabbi Marcia has something to say.
Thank you, very and briefly. But for those of you who are part of Daniel Levine's last 4-session class that just concluded last week, he was the theme was sort of great medieval debates that changed Judaism forever. And he was arguing, as you are, that Maimonides, who seemed like a rationalist, actually was a mystic. Yes. And he couldn't go deep into it, but that was one of the reasons I thought it would be so exciting for you to sort of pick up on mysticism, because Daniel opened up the Pandora's box, but it wasn't able to land anywhere. But it was a fascinating class, and all of our previous ALI classes are archived on our website. And each class stands on its own. So if you'd like to learn more about Maimonides as a mystic, feel free to go on our website and visit the archives. Thank you, K'vod. I just wanted to make that link.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And also, if we ever want to do another class that's more deep into Maimonides mysticism, that was also my rabbinic thesis, especially the the fusion and the relationship between Jewish and Sufi mystics during that time and how that influenced Judaism.
I so badly want that class. You just let me know when you're ready to teach it. That's all I can say.
All right, that's good. Okay, so let me, before we move on, I'm gonna put a link in the chat for a source sheet that I will be going through. So let me just take a moment to do that. And you can open that. It's now in the chat. If you want to click on that, you'll be able to follow along with me here. And if you don't, for some reason, if it's too difficult to open up that source sheet, you don't know it, I'm going to actually be reading things from the source sheet out loud and talking about it. So even if you don't have it in front of you, no problem. Okay, so now we've moved up into around the beginning of the 18th century, about the beginning of 1700s, and this is now something that is very new that opens up called Hasidism. And Hasid, as you see on your short source sheet, the kind of some brief overview piece is Hasidut is the spiritual revival movement that sprang up in Ukraine and Poland in the 18th century, played a decisive role in the history of European Jewry on the eve of modernity, right? Like right before modernity being talked about as the Enlightenment period, the time when we were starting to, where Europe and was starting to open up to more rational ideas, scientific ideas. This was right before that kind of that big move to rationalism. The word Hasid from Hasidism or Hasidut is related to Chesed or kindness. It's long meant a devout or pious person. But with the advent of Hasidut, it came to mean the follower of a Hasidic Rebbe or spiritual teacher. Hasidut or Hasidic Judaism strengthened existing communities and also created new communities, significantly shaping the demographics and consciousness of the Jewish people from 1760 to this day. And Hasidism, as Art Green says, is primarily a devotional mysticism. The question being asked over and over in the sources is not what is the nature of being, but rather how do I properly serve God, right? And that's a big difference. What is the nature of being is an intellectual question that looks at physics and metaphysics, where how do I properly serve God is how do I live my life? How do I make choices that reflect the deep reality that I'm a part of? And the big shift in this from all of the previous mysticism, which is so much more about what is the nature of being, is that everything else was really only accessible to scholars or to people that were deeply learned in Torah. Kabbalah is, as it was in the Zohar and Lurianic Kabbalah, is really sophisticated and really complicated, and a lot of ideas that are based on earlier rabbinic Judaism. So to be a Kabbalist or a practitioner or a study of Jewish mysticism up until the 18th century was you had to be really immersed in sources. You had to be really knowledgeable. And that was only a small part of the Jewish population. Amcha, or the people in general, were not schooled in any of this, right? Think about, I'm watching now probably for the 120th time Fiddler on the Roof with my 10-year-old. And, you know, think about Tevye and think about Anatevka and think about that Eastern European shtetl. And as Tevye is singing "If I Were a Rich Man," and he said, you know, I would have the time that I'd lack to sit in the synagogue and pray, and I'd study holy book with the learned men 7 hours every day. That would be the sweetest thing of all, right? Tevye, as a milkman or as, you know, did not have the time to study these books or to be able to get into this. So that was the reality for most people. But with Hasidism, and really as we're going to transition in a moment into the coming of the Baal Shem Tov, this suddenly made this kind of mysticism and this direct experience available to the common people. And this last piece on the sheet from Rachel Elior, Israeli scholar, she says, Hasidism originated in a mystical awakening that altered conceptions of the relationship between man and God. It was the product of an eruption of charismatic piety that drew its legitimacy from a consciousness of contact with superior realms. So this drew its legitimacy from a consciousness of contact with superior realms, right? This is all of the Kabbalah and all of the mysticism that had come before, which talked so much about superior realms and about deeper levels of consciousness. And all of a sudden now, the ordinary person is being offered a way to open to God, to reality in this way. So in 1700, we have the birth of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael ben Eliezer. He's often called the Baal Shem Tov, which in Hebrew is an acronym, the Besht. Baal Shem, master of the good name, Tov. He was a mystic, he was a healer, he was a teacher. Baal Shem Tov means master of the good name, or maybe master of one with a good reputation. And some beautiful pieces that have been talked about from the Baal Shem Tov. Martin Buber, who we're going to talk about a little bit more next week, he, in his Tales of the Hasidim, says, they say at once when all souls were gathered in Adam's soul, at the hour he stood beside the tree of knowledge, the soul of the Baal Shem Tov went away and didn't eat of the fruit of the tree. Right? So this idea that this mystical idea, all of our souls are present in the Garden of Eden, and the tree of life, which is what we can eat the fruit of, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that is what splits our consciousness into duality and many pieces all the way around, that is responsible for the way that we feel separate in this life and in this world. The soul of the Baal Shem never ate from that tree, meaning he always had a deep awareness and connection with the unity of God. Elie Wiesel says, the Baal Shem was a man of the people in the truest sense of the word. So the Baal Shem Tov was born, lived, and died in what we call Ukraine. He was born to poor parents, Eliezer and Sarah, in West Ukraine. In 1703, his parents died. He became an orphan, and he was trusted to the Jewish community of Tlostay. In 1710, he finished Cheder, Hebrew school, and became an assistant to the Milamed, the Hebrew instructor in the Cheder. And sometime in maybe around 1712, scholars say that he became the shamash, or the caretaker of the local synagogue. He was periodically hired as a teacher's assistant in the Cheders of the small villages through which he passed through. In 1716, he married, but soon his wife died, and he went on traveling through Eastern Galicia. And after serving for a long time as a helper in various small communities as West Ukraine, he settled in as a teacher in Tlostay. The Besht, or the Baal Shem Tov, was introduced to Kabbalah by Rabbi Adam Baal Shem of Ropshitz, and became the leader of a Kabbalistic circle when he was 18 years old. Okay, so this guy, this really deep person, studied Kabbalah and became a leader and somehow grasped these concepts. He achieved some local acclaim as a wise mediator and arbitrator in legal disputes among Jews. And he eventually marries Chana of Brody, and the couple moves to a village in the Carpathian Mountains, where their only income was from his work digging clay and lime. All right, so, had to just make a living. They had 2 children, Udal and Tzvi Hirsch. The Besht later took a position as a shochet, which is a ritual butcher, which he soon gave up to manage a village tavern that his brother-in-law bought for him. He often secluded himself in the mountains and woods for long periods. And during those many years that he lived in the woods and came into contact with the peasants, he learned how to use plants for healing purposes. In fact, his appearance in public was that of an ordinary Baal Shem, which was meaning that he wrote amulets and prescribed cures. And he's recorded as effecting cures and expelling demons and evil spirits, Shadim, right? So this is kind of like this image of this wonder worker. On one hand, he's really schooled in Jewish learning and in Kabbalah and lives in the mountains and spends all this time, but then he comes into the village and is doing what's called magical Kabbalah, which is this whole piece of amulets, chamsas, spells, all this kind of things. And then after many years of kind of secretive work, he decides around 1740 to publicly teach in the shtetl of Medzebozh, and people, mostly from the spiritual elite, comes to listen to him. And from this point on, this last 20 years of his life, 1740 to 1760, Medzebozh, he lives openly as a teacher, a healer, a rebbe, and Medzebozh becomes the seat of the Hasidic movement and of the Medzebozh Hasidic dynasty. His following gradually increases, and with it is the hostility of the Talmudists who vigorously opposed Hasidut. All right, so he is, and what are they opposing? That this mitnagdim, or these opponents, is he starts living and teaching and preaching a Judaism that, while completely consistent with Jewish texts forward, is really for the common person, is really has some important teachings that you can serve God in any moment with any person. It doesn't have to be studying Torah in a Beit Midrash. It doesn't have to be just in traditional prayer. It can be in nature. It can be walking everywhere. This was kind of the teaching that he taught. And the people that came around him were, especially the spiritual elite, they were deeply, of course, involved in Jewish practice and observance, many of them rabbis and all of that. But his emphasis was in it, which we'll talk about in a deeper way, was on joy, was about connection, was about God consciousness. And this was very threatening to the Talmudic elite at that point, that saw his way and his lack of maybe focus on the strictures of halakha, of Jewish law, to be threatening to the tradition. We can say that, he has a circle of students, the Maggid of Mezrich, Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, and others that eventually go ahead and spread Hasidut and his teachings throughout Eastern Europe. Hasidut is very diverse, but all Hasidim see themselves as evolving from the Besht and following his teachings. He's the uniting factor. The Besht is so important largely because of his role assigned to him by the later movement. Okay, so in a moment, we're going to transition to try to give a little bit more of a taste of what were some of the key teachings of Hasidism that really began to characterize this radical spirituality of the time. We'll go from there into to what we're now calling Neo-Hasidism. But before continuing, just want to open up for any questions or comments regarding kind of getting up to this time and this beginning of this new kind of Jewish spirituality. So you feel free to raise your hand, or yes, Cheryl.
I have a question. As you explain it, it's not as religious. And when we look at like Hasidism now, it's like ultra Orthodox. We would consider it under. And this sounds so different than like the beginnings of it. Is that true, that it was a much different type of Hasidism when it started?
Yes and no. And I want to hold that for a second because I'm going to speak to that directly as I want to first put the teachings, but I will say yes and no in that, yes, in that people at that time, like Jewish observance and halakha and life was just was so in the fabric of life at that time. Again, like I mean, think Fiddler on the Roof and think about, Tevye. Like Tevye and his family, would you call them ultra Orthodox? No. Were they religious? Did everything stop on Shabbat? And we see, Sabbath prayer, as Golda's trying to speak to Tevye about Laser Wolf, meeting Laser Wolf. Tevye's like chanting Ashrei at the beginning of the Mincha service. He's like, shh, I'm like, it was just kind of part and parcel of Jewish life. So it's not to say that people weren't religious and they weren't doing those, but ultra-Orthodoxy is more of a sociological and religious phenomenon that happened more with the birth of the Reform movement in 1850. And we'll talk about that and how that took a different direction as the ultra-Orthodoxy we know tonight. But what I will say is what was very different is there wasn't this incredible sense of closed offness, of having to do things right. That was not the spirit of this time.
Thank you.
Sylvia.
Thank you. Morning, Rabbi. I understand from some of my readings that Hasidim in the beginning, which was a very mystical movement, and was very conversant with meditation as time went along, that changed. And do you know when that changed, and has it changed back?
Okay, so we'll get there too. We'll also great question, but we again like kind of part of this we're right now talking about the early piece of Hasidism, and we will get to Neo-Hasidism and what happened along, but that's all part of that story. So you're here for the right reasons with those questions. Ellen.
Thanks.
Oh, you got to unmute.
I've been to several Jewish renewal camps and education sessions. Will you be talking about why they call themselves Neo-Hasidic?
Yes. 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 So let's go on here because it seems like this is great. Everybody's kind of like, how do we get to where we are now and what all of that is? So let's move in that direction and then we'll have more discussion. So if you look in your source sheet, we're now on the teachings of Hasidism. And this is kind of the core piece that opened with the Baal Shem Tov and subsequent teachers. And next session, we're going to go into get to look at some of the original sources from the Baal Shem and some of the other teachers. But the first one is that all existence is radiant with divine presence. Okay. The power of the maker is within the made is a common Hasidic watchword, teaches that all creation reflects the godly hand that in every moment creates it anew. Our ordinary view of existence, one that separates person from God, matter from spirit, subject from object, is essentially superficial. Everything that happens comes from the hand of God. There is no moment, place, or deed in which God is not present. Were our eyes truly open, and the purpose of all religious life is to help in that opening, we would see that there is no reality outside of God, Yud He Vav He, the God of all being. The indwelling divine presence, while hidden from sight, is the ultimate truth of existence. Okay, so this is huge, opening, something that is not different than our original sources, meaning that when we say the Shema, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, God is one, right? This idea that this is a different description of what it means of God being one is that everything is an expression of God. It's not us here, God up there, but that within all of us inside, everywhere we look in creation, God's presence is radiating throughout all of it. It's in it. It's, when we say that God is the indwelling divine presence, or the word Shekhinah, that aspect of God that we experience within ourselves and within creation is a complement to the presence that goes beyond what we can feel and taste and see with our senses, that God is also transcendent, which also gets talked about as Hakadosh Baruch Hu, or other aspects of divine expression or emanation. But the main piece here is everything is God. So where does that, and that ultimately suddenly becomes accessible for everybody, right? If we're looking at what was it about this kind of spirituality? Well, now, if you look at the second one, the divine presence is to be discovered and joyously celebrated through all of life. The service of God is not limited to the hours of prayer, study, and specific commandments. Even as these precise God-given forms of worship are to be carried out with great devotion, the fulfillment of the specific commandments also serves a broader purpose that touches our every deed, inspiration and example for the sanctification of all of the rest of life. God's presence is everywhere, waiting to be revealed. The discovering of sparks of divine energy, even in the most unlikely places, is essential to the religious task. All right, so this now, again, if you look, this particular way of framing it is, it's not that we don't engage in mitzvot and just live in a secular way and see God in everything, but the whole purpose of Jewish practice, halakha, living a religious life, is not just so that God can be experienced in those specific actions of the mitzvot, but that everything becomes opportunities for mitzvot. Everything becomes an opportunity for God awareness. The Baal Shem Tov would teach, because this was who he was teaching to. Don't think that if you're walking along the way and you're going to study Torah and somebody comes and approaches you, don't think that that is any less of an opportunity for God awareness than your study of Torah. So what we're also going to talk about a little bit more next week, and as we start to get into some of the Neo-Hasidic luminaries, one being Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, the head of the Jewish Renewal Movement, founder of the Jewish Renewal Movement, may his memory be for a blessing. He has a concept which we're going to study next week, which is called paradigm shift, which really kind of shows that shift, even in thinking about God, where we go from a deistic, from a polytheistic to a deistic to a theistic to a pantheistic idea and concept of God, that even our own way of thinking about things throughout Jewish history and Jewish time has continued to evolve and change. And he kind of speaks about how that moves through the different historical periods up until this present time. Okay, the third point here in kind of core Hasidic concepts is that Torah, traditional Jewish teaching in both the narrowest and broadest sense, is to guide every aspect of one's life. It is the eternal will and teaching of God, but it's also the mysterious embodiment of God's own self, as is the human soul. Torah is our guide to help us discover the divine message imprinted in our hearts. Constant engagement with Torah, seeking out the light hidden deep within it, inspires an ongoing creative quest for new and deeper meanings that in turn energizes our spiritual life. So this is another big, huge development at the time of what Torah is about, right? When it says that it is the mysterious embodiment of God's own self, right? This is a different idea of Torah as a guidebook to life. And here, what we speak about as Torah refers more back to an early midrash. This is a rabbinic midrash that says, God looked into Torah to create the world. God looked into Torah to create the world. And in this, Torah, right, is, so in order to look into Torah to create the world, you can't say that this is a book, right? Because this is before, books got created and all of that, but that in somehow the very blueprint for the ongoing development of creation is what Torah is really about. God looked into Torah to create the world. God looked into God's own being in some way to bring forth the world. So when we start to study Torah from this perspective, Torah becomes a connection with divinity. And not only with divinity, but it's also to discover the divine message imprinted within our own hearts. Remember, if everything is an expression of God, that means us too. Our own depths are synonymous with the depths of God. So Torah becomes studying Torah is the looking into a mirror in which we see our deepest selves. And so now studying Torah, when we read these stories, we're not just reading stories about other people, we're reading stories about our own deep, deep nature. And not only that, but the nature of reality and creation. The fourth one is our human task includes uplifting and transforming our emotional selves and our moral way of acting, seeking to become ever more perfect vessels for God's service. The inner process begins with the key devotional pair of love and fear. We need to purify both of these in our lives, coming to understand that all true love derives from and leads back to the love of God, and that God alone is the proper subject of our fear and awe. Our loves, desires, needs, and fears are in a fallen state and need to be uplifted. All moral growth begins with this insight. Generosity, open-heartedness, and compassion towards ourselves as well as others are essential religious values. Condescension, judging, and especially anger, even for the sake of righteousness, are to be avoided, right? So this now is the deeper idea of tikkun, right? We think about tikkun olam for our present day piece as, repairing the world, social action, making the world a better place. But tikkun earlier in Kabbalah was about, it really comes from Lurianic Kabbalah, the 16th century northern Sfat, which is looked at that everything we do, every mitzvah is an opportunity to release sparks, to uplift that which is fallen in creation. And where Kabbalah focuses on this more cosmic divine sense that our world is broken in a broken state, the birth of Hasidism, and I would say in line with another movement that was happening and had some overlap at that time, which is the Musar movement, or movement that's more focused on character development, really focused on tikkun, or repair, as the repair of our own soul, our own our own loves, desires, fears, to be able to bring those to God and bring those to a wider place. And so the religious life is kind of an inner growing, inner purifying place. Now, we haven't kind of gotten there, but kind of the sneak preview into Neo-Hasidism right now takes tikkun as not just something that is in our individual self, but that it is also in the world at large and engaging in social action. And so this is a shout out today for Martin Luther King Day, Martin Luther King Jr., who really lived this kind of Neo-Hasidic perspective, in that he was a religious person and really saw both the purifying of one's own heart and the change of society to live in a world where the divine image is reflected in all people. That was the kind of tikkun that the Neo-Hasidic perspective now would embrace. So it took it another step from the Hasidic. And then finally, a person who fully embodies these teachings and personal qualities, or midot, is to be considered a tzaddik, or a righteous one. The cultivation of such souls is the great goal of Hasidic teaching. Their presence is a source of blessing to those around them. They are also called upon to serve as models and teachers. The tzaddik, or the spiritual master, stands at the center of a circle of Hasidim, or disciples, who are devoted both to their teacher and to the community they create around him. And here we're saying him specifically because at this time they were all men. The relationship between master and disciple is thus complemented by the intense fellowship fostered within the Hasidic community. So that was another big core piece of Hasidism, which is that now your rabbi is if you wanted to say the function of a rabbi up until this time was to be a teacher, was to teach people Torah, guide people in ways of Jewish life, make decisions about Jewish law. That was the role of the rabbi. Now there is the Rebbe. And the Rebbe is not just about all of those things about the rabbi, but also now someone who can help connect you to the depth of your own soul, who can help connect you to a life of meaning and purpose through what it is that you do, to be able to serve God in all ways. That becomes the role of the Rebbe. And what I'll just say now is, I know I'm kind of jumping ahead to Neo-Hasidism, and we'll get there for a moment, but I would say my own kind of Neo-Hasidic drash on this idea of a tzaddik, or a righteous person, where the Hasidic idea of the tzaddik is that this is an individual who is a very deep and high holy person who we can learn from and grow from. And there certainly are people in our lives that we might know or recognize as being kind of those pathways, those guideposts among our journey. I would say that a tzaddik is that each one of us has the opportunity to be a tzaddik in any given moment. We can have moments of being a tzaddik, moments in which our own sense of connection with life and the unity of God can be expressed in acts of kindness, in acts of justice, in integrity, and that is something that is available to each one of us at any moment. It doesn't have to be this image of perfection that doesn't include us, but you know, we go back and forth and in and out, and so I would, you know, that's another example. We'll get a little bit more into this when we talk about Neo-Hasidism. But now one of the values of Neo-Hasidism is one value of inclusivity. So this idea of a tzaddik as being available to each one of us is another coming from that spirit of inclusivity. Okay. The next piece, but before we go there, the next piece is now to talk about some of the questions of contemporary Hasidism. Why is what we see around us now in Hasidism not look like what was being articulated in that early piece and with the Baal Shem Tov and his students? And then what is this movement of Neo-Hasidism? So before we kind of get there, any questions about the teachings of Hasidism as kind of these bullet points that we went through? Anything that would help your own kind of understanding of these ideas or principles? Rabbi Marcia.
Well, you had mentioned the Musar movement, and it was my understanding that the evolution of Musar really came from what was a non-Hasidic reaction to the popularity and the incredible needs that were being filled by the Hasidic movement for people who found that as a movement not in line with the Judaism that they knew, but understood that the focus on character and goodness was not necessarily something that Jewish law emphasized, and this was sort of a complement to that. So can you just say a little bit about Musar and its relationship, if directly, to the rise of the Hasidic popularity?
Yes. So it's interesting when we talk about Musar, which just for a very quick piece we'll just translate right now as character development, as being able to really, the essential kind of focus of Musar is kind of the qualities of who we show up, how we show up in the world, who we're going to be in the world, and specifically a awareness of the difficulty, the psychological difficulties in living a life of Jewish piety and Torah and all of those things. So it's, the Musar movement one could talk about as in the 19th century, but it really goes back, Bachya ibn Pakuda and Chovot Levavot. There's another text called Orchot, which is like 10th century. Orchot Tzadikim, another way of the Tzadikim, another earlier text in the Middle Ages. There was this focus on character development, but it didn't really become a movement until Rabbi Israel Salanter in the 19th century. And I think this was also another, as you said really well, Rabbi Marsha, I wouldn't say that it was a reaction against Hasidism at all. But I would say that it was a bit of a reaction against the kind of hardcore Talmudic way in Judaism that did not focus on as much on who we are in the world, what we do in the world, didn't really focus on what gets in the way psychologically of living the teachings that we go through, that we experience in the rabbinic teachings in the Torah. And so the Musar kind of movement, or Musar houses and teachings that really focused on that, like Hasidism, were filling a lack of focus, at that time. So I would say that both Hasidism and Musar were reactions in some way to that lack of focus on how hard it is to actually be the kind of person we want to be.
And at such a difficult time in history when most Jewish people did not have what you'd call, the gravy train. It was very hard to be a person and to eke out a living. And so this both probably provided great comfort.
Yes, thank you. Sylvia.
Thank you. Actually, on the lines of what I was thinking was, can you speak to that, whereby we're coming up in a period of time which is kind of in between. We're kind of leaving the Middle Ages, and we were relatively okay, especially in Spain and Portugal and Turkey. We were pretty okay. And at the end of the 15th century, we became pretty much targets and have been run around and persecuted and murdered and shut up in ghettos for a couple centuries then. And then into Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment, which kind of went part and parcel with the Western European Enlightenment. So we were in a better spot again. So we could do and think different things. So do you think, okay, so my question is, I guess, do you think that this movement had to do in good part with what was, I mean, it must have been a terrifying time with what was going on in the world, our world.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think absolutely it was. And for a lot of the reasons that, Rabbi Marsha also spoke about of, life was hard, was really hard. But I think, but as we talked about, this was right on the eve of modernity when the Baal Shem Tov came forward. So let's now get into this a little bit. And this will speak to your question, Sheila, about exclusion of women and how do we relate to all of these things. So the transplanted Eastern European Hasidism that exists today in both Israel and the diaspora it embodies a pale reflection of these teachings that we're talking about. And I think that's what people are mentioning. How can we take these teachings and square it with what we see in many of these ultra-Orthodox Hasidic communities? And since Hasidism alignment with ultra-Orthodoxy in the early 19th century and its really fierce battle with emerging secularism as that century proceeded, it's dedicated most of its energies to preserving the old ways of Jewish life in every detail, rather than seeking out new realms in which to proclaim God's presence. So that the creative and spiritual expansive teachings of its first generations came to be replaced by an extreme conservatism. So this is part of just also understanding the 19th century and the birth of denominations, because this is really what we're speaking about, right? So with the advent of the Enlightenment, of rational thinking and kind of coming out of the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages of human society in general, especially in Europe, for the first time, Jews were able to be admitted into universities and able to participate in the wider world in a way that they never had before. And so now the Jews are coming out of the shtetls into metropolitan European cities and able to participate in academia and all of this. And with all of that became this real rejection of Judaism, right? As not rational, not scientific, all that stuff, a rejection of that shtetl life for new opportunities. And this is what really precipitates the birth of the Reform movement in Germany, and then later in the United States. People think about the Reform movement as the watering down of Judaism, but really the impetus of the Reform movement was to keep Judaism alive within Jews that were trying to integrate into larger society. So yes, there was the taking out of a lot of Hebrew and having things just be in German or in English. And yes, there was the pushing away of the old ways of davening and prayer, of shuckling and muttering, and instead having services look more like Protestant churches where everybody faces forward and looks forward on that, right? What we know of that in our world today was from the Reform movement to help us be more like everybody else. The idea of Judaism being a religion and not a people came from the Reform movement, so that we could be accepted in whatever country we were in and not be a people with a different agenda aligned with Israel, all of those things, but serving that. So with that Reform movement and that push towards letting go of so many aspects of Jewish tradition, but at the same time, in an effort to preserve Jewish religious identity, that had a huge backlash. And that huge backlash was all of a sudden, if you had a real organic kind of religious community like Fiddler on the Roof, like Tevye, where it wasn't so focused on what you did right or what you didn't do right or any of those things, you just kind of lived Jewish life and community. Now all of a sudden, there's the merger of orthodoxy, right? Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy, which says, got to do it just like this and got to kind of clamp down here because we're going to lose our tradition. And, it's a big, larger conversation about the evolution of the conservative movement from that. But before there was the conservative movement, there was the Chatam Sofer, in the creator of ultra-Orthodoxy in the 19th century, and there was the Reform movement. So that extreme conservatism is what kind of replaced this vibrant, early Hasidic vision. And while those sparks of that original vision can be found in the surviving reborn, Hasidic communities, the outer shell in which they're housed makes it extremely difficult for outsiders to access the wisdom there. So in many of these Hasidic communities, these very close, there is still mystical teachings being, forward. I mean, I think the one that most of us are most familiar with because of their unique mission is Chabad, right? Chabad, different than, because of the Rebbe's vision, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's vision of taking Judaism out to the masses. Chabad is unique, ultra-Orthodox community because it's about it's not about being insular, but it's about sharing out. And yet the relationship to Judaism, as welcoming and amazing Chabad is, it still is a very Orthodox, expression of Judaism that doesn't allow leadership of women or others or all that. But you still will find in Chabad these teachings, right? So one of the Baal Shem Tov's main students, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, and he's really the founder of Chabad lineage. And so all of the teachers of Chabad going through has a lot of these teachings that go all the way back to the Baal Shem Tov, but it's still within a very conservative model. So what's important to say about this as far as American Judaism goes is American Judaism, as it emerged in the 19th century, presented Judaism in rational and liberal categories that had emerged from post-Enlightenment circles, primarily in Germany. And these denominational divisions that came to characterize American Jewry had everything to do with degrees of halachic obligation, while having very little to say about the inner self, awareness of divine presence, or a life of passionate devotion, right? Which is a lot of how a lot of us were raised in our own, we weren't raised with these kinds of spiritual teachings and this fire of davening and prayer. It was very kind of rational, Hebrew school, this, that. Hasidism was looked down upon well into the latter half of the 20th century. But, and here's where we switch, in the past 3 or 4 decades, there have been attempts to reintegrate these once discarded mystical terms, practices, and understandings of Hasidism. Collections of Hasidic teachings are newly available in translation. Hasidic-inspired musical compositions are performed in Reform synagogues. Various retreats emphasize personal prayer and meditation, as we just had. The fact that we just had this meditation retreat last week here at Brandeis Bardeen, Temple Bethel's 8th annual Jewish meditation retreat, reflects this new opening. Courses in mysticism are offered in rabbinical seminaries and universities. Distinctly mystical practices of all-night study, tikkunim on Shavuot, staying up all night and learning, Tu B'Shvat seders. These are all mystical rituals and ideas that have become familiar in liberal Jewish circles. So now we have, this is kind of finished up, Neo-Hasidism is emerging now within the broader context of this postmodern consciousness preceding and following the turn of the 20th century. And there's 2 elements that really characterize this new way of thinking that we're calling Neo-Hasidism. One is the quest for ancient strands of wisdom that Westerners abandoned in the move towards science-based modernity that might help us recover a lost sense of humanity, maybe even prevent us in a rush towards nuclear annihilation or planetary destruction. Maybe turning towards spiritual masters and wisdom can offer guidance during this time, right? So this is one piece that we as a human kind of consciousness now in this 21st century are now thinking there could be something here to help. As amazing as the world is with modernity and what we have and the internet and all of this, we also see this hunger and deficiency in the human soul that is reflecting everywhere in our planet. And maybe there's something here. So there's this pushback. And then the second, and this is a really important piece, is that the postmodern student of religious traditions no longer requires the sources offering such wisdom that we have to be literally true, right? We don't have to believe that at a historical moment in time, we had the creation of the world, as in described in the Garden of Eden. We don't have to believe that the Exodus from Egypt and the revelation at Sinai absolutely happened at a historical moment of time. Maybe it did, but we don't have to believe that in order to be able to have these stories speak to us. Their insights can be translated in terms and settings that work for the contemporary seeker. So now all of a sudden, with those two pieces, we can now delve into these teachings of early Hasidism and continue to capitalize on those teachings in a postmodern world that has values of inclusivity, that has values of ecological awareness. And there have been so many leading figures that have brought this development into Judaism, which we're going to explore next week. Martin Buber was in the early part of the 20th century, was a first big proponent to articulate Hasidism in this new way. Abraham Joshua Heschel was a key figure in being able to bring some of these deeper teachings into liberal Jewish religious life. And Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi and Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, blessed memory, founder of what we call the Jewish Renewal Movement, which we'll talk more about next week too, and Rabbi Art Green have also been starting to say Judaism is something that can take these teachings, can embrace teachings from other traditions, can be concerned with how do we live in a way that honors the values that we experience in the world, but roots them in this kind of awareness of God being present in everything and everywhere, and Torah being our guide in that. So I know I'm just a couple minutes after here. I don't know, Rabbi Marsha, if we want to just close it right there or leave a few moments for questions or comments.
Well, I would, if you have 2 minutes, if anybody has a question, but I would say that, your articulation of how it came to be that the Hasidic movement, obviously was so rooted originally in Orthodoxy because that's all there was. And then largely the proponents of it were trying to protect the traditions because that's where the world was going in this direction. And what Neo-Hasidism has done is it's created the bridge between any kind of Jewish Reformation of practice, any kind, not just the Reform movement, but any kind of Reformation of practice, with the fascinating and huge and fabulous teachings of the Hasidic movement, which could and should be the purview of anyone. Yes. So, I mean, that's really fantastic. So thank you for sharing it in that way.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And what I would just add to that too, which we'll focus on next, especially as we get into the teachings of Reb Zalman or Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlomi, is even though we characterize the early Hasidic movement as something that was emerging in Orthodoxy, I would just argue that Orthodoxy as a concept was not something that we really came onto the scene until 1850, 1860. Right? There was just Jewish religious life, but the truth is that Judaism has been renewed in every generation, all the way through what Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof articulates so beautifully as tradition, but then also the pull in Fiddler on the Roof between tradition and modernity and living things in new ways and that pull has always been a part of Judaism in every age. And so Orthodoxy, the sense that says we can't change or we can't renew, was a development that was even post early Hasidic. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, because that's what the Talmud is all about, changing and questioning and and digging deeper. I just want to let you know that next week, I believe Bex Rosenblatt is going to start a 3 weeks of sessions interspersed with Rabbi Weider on government, what the Tanakh has to say about governmental systems. It's going to be really interesting. She's such a great teacher. So I'm so glad that all of you came today. Please join our ALI meeting list. Thank you all for everybody who supports this program and makes it possible for the year. We really appreciate your support. And K'vod, it was a joy to learn with you. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Oh, but before that, if you live in Orange County, please join us at the Jewish Community Center on Sunday, January 21st for K'vod's next Sundays in Silence and Spirit in-person meditation, open to anybody in the community. Cheryl, feel free to fly in from Vegas. I think that's where you live. But it's really, it's just a beautiful experience.
Thank you. Rabbi Marcia, if I may too, just for everybody to know too, if you want to spend more time practicing singing this kind of Judaism that we're talking about, the third week of every month is your weekend to kind of block off. So Friday night at Temple Bethel, we have a Soul Spark Shabbat service, meditative musical service. That Saturday morning, Jerusalem Shabbat is something that, again, focusing more on nigunim and meditation. And then, as Rabbi Marcia said, the Sunday morning at the JCC at 9:30, full weekend. So the third of the weekend.
Anytime you want to reinvent your Tuesday Zoom meditation would be just really cool too. I know you have a lot to do, but that's such a beautiful space that you opened up for us.
Yeah, every Tuesday morning online, 9 a.m. You can join for a meditation and spiritual practice Zoom 1 hour. It can be,
and those sessions are recorded, so you can access them on Rabbi Weider's website as well.
You can, and I think on the collaborative there is the info with the link and everything.
All of it, everything.
Yes,
on the collaborative website.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good to be with everybody. Have a wonderful day.